On the morning of February 7th, 2026, I woke up to a peculiar video on my feed where someone named Casual Pokeplayer fired up Pokemon Emerald using a Mudkip and a Wurmple to beat Pokemon Emerald in under 10 minutes. This absolutely blew my mind because all it took to do that was going into a Pokemon Center to rename boxes, saving 4 times in a row, then resetting twice before the game yelled at them that your save file is corrupted. Then the moment they were back into the game, they deposited Mudkip, then saved and reset one last time to turn their beloved Mudkip into a giant question mark that somehow put them inside of the Hall of Fame the moment they swapped places with Wurmple. Now, to anyone not in the know, this might seem like either a cheat code was used or a casual player stumbled onto this by accident given their username. But this was anything but an accident because 2 weeks later on February 24th, another video named Pokemon Leaf Green in 7 minutes and 46 seconds was uploaded to the same channel. Then an entire day later, Pokemon Sapphire would follow along with it, absolutely shattering every Generation 3 Pokemon game faster than it had ever been shattered before, some by a few minutes and others by an entire hour. So how in the world is this even possible? Well, a lot of modern Pokemon glitches revolve around messing with the game's memory by using mail to manipulate data structures that exist inside Pokemon. But as it turns out, mail isn't actually required if you can find another way to manipulate how the game loads its save data. And that is exactly what Casual Pokeplayer discovered by experimenting with something called save corruption. Now imagine when you hear the term save corruption, you probably imagine random bits of data being damaged. But what's actually happening is the game loads a save file that's already partially written, then mixes it with an older backup save file. So how do you do that exactly? Essentially, if you interrupt the process of saving a Pokemon game in just the right way, you can create a save corruption, with the most broken example of this being put into play in the 80% speedrun of Pokemon Red, where the moment you spawn into your house, you can just corrupt your save file with the right timing to fill up your bag with a crazy amount of data, and with a bit of swapping around in that bag, you can tell your game to trigger the Hall of Fame sequence within just 1 minute of playing the game. But doing this in a Generation 3 Pokemon game isn't quite as simple as Pokemon Red, and to know exactly why, let's go through the game that started it all, Pokemon Emerald. This might be a weird question, but do you enjoy living on planet Earth? No? Well, I can't really change that, but what I can do is tell you about today's sponsor, Petite Planet, a game that'll put you in a completely cozy state of mind that can help you forget about the actual planet for one that's spicing up the life sim genre. Created by the fantastic minds behind games like Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail, and Zenless Zone Zero have come together to bring you a super cozy life sim where you literally terraform, build societies, and decorate your home inside of a tiny planet. But like all great life sims, you got your bug catching, fishing, rummaging around nature, planting and tending to the wildlife and local villagers, creating a nice daily loop that you can come back to over and over again. Let me just say that the attention to detail on decorating is phenomenal. You name it, you can probably decorate it to your heart's content and beautify it to be even more beautiful than the game already is. It's seriously all just so cozy and whimsical, and it gets even better with how they include an entire freaking story called the Star Sea Voyage. If the name doesn't already draw you in, then I don't know what to say other than what I wrote here apparently, about how you can go on an adventure beyond your planet to explore more petite planets across the galaxy, interacting with important NPCs known as neighbors, each of which has a special sort of job and will give you a quest to do something where you explore, puzzle solve, and are then eventually rewarded for your efforts. But I think what I find most surprising is that there is a giant multiplayer hub world where you can meet other people and interact and socialize with that might be just as obsessed with life sims as the rest of us. There's seriously so much to love about this game, and if you're wanting to try out this cozy cosmic life sim with charming characters, exploration, and social play, be sure to sign up for Petite Planet Beta right now. Get an exclusive item at launch. Link for signups will be in the description. Under normal circumstances, it takes about 2 hours and 30 minutes to beat Pokemon Emerald as a speedrun. And that type of speedrun collects all 8 badges and beats the Elite Four and Champion without a single glitch. If we dive even further to the glitchy speedruns, previously we could only go as far as to beat Emerald in about 1 hour and 20 minutes. Because the big thing that used to set off glitches in Emerald were Palmeg berries. And the closest Palmeg berry you could get your hands on required you to obtain a minimum of 5 badges in order to corrupt a Pokemon into an egg that could hatch you straight into the Hall of Fame. But with save corruption, you don't even need a single badge. So instead of obtaining badges or berries, our goal becomes to get through a list of things needed to warp to the Hall of Fame that look like this. First, we'll need to get a Pokemon with specific data built into it, obtain a second Pokemon to be able to move Pokemon around in our PC, have a very specific trainer ID and secret ID combination, find a way to fuse old save data with new save data, change our box names to weird looking characters, put our special data Pokemon into a specific slot in a specific box, reset the game, then swap the special data Pokemon with our extra party member to warp to the Hall of Fame. While the list is short and sweet, the specifics to do it are really complicated. So you remember all the saving that was being done in the speedrun by casual Pokeplayer? Well, the reason for all those saves is because Generation 3 Pokemon games actually keep two versions of your save file at all times. One is the current save file, while the other acts as a backup in case something goes wrong while saving. And instead of storing the save as one big block of data, the game sort of splits this into many different smaller pieces that are written across flash memory. But the real trick for the speedrun happens when you interrupt that saving process at just the right time. Because once the game is reading a save file where certain pieces of data no longer line up correctly, that mismatch of saves can cause Pokemon data to be interpreted in completely unintended ways, which is where Mudkip enters the picture. But it's not exactly Mudkip that matters. What actually matters is the encryption key that Pokemon games use to protect a Pokemon's internal data. You see, that little encryption key we're looking for is generated from a Pokemon's personality ID, which is a unique number that gets generated when a Pokemon is first created. And if we then combine that personality ID with the player's trainer ID and secret ID, that Pokemon becomes a special type of glitchy Pokemon capable of triggering in-game actions to enter the Hall of Fame in a speedrun. But this particular method using the TID, SID, and PID combination in Emerald was only really possible because casual Pokeplayer speedrun was a tool-assisted speedrun. If you've never seen a task before or don't know what it is, it's essentially a speedrun where a person goes through the entire game frame by frame, forming a speedrun with perfectly engineered outcomes. And because of the level of precision a tool-assisted speedrun has, it can set up the save corruption after only 4 saves with no issues. But for a human speedrunner, they can't really get a TID-SID combination as easily, and will have to save 10 extra times with how inconsistent setting up a save corruption save file is for a human, because every time the game saves, it writes these chunks of data sequentially across those sectors with a slight shift as to which sector ends up being used each time. But unlike a tool-assisted speedrun, we have no way of knowing where the specific chunks of data we're looking for are until that 14th save, because that is when the game resets the save to a state where a human can consistently start corrupting their save. As for the TID-SID issue, manipulating both of them for a human is yet another inconsistent thing in Pokemon Emerald because of how they are generated using something known as Timer 1, which is a hardware timer that runs at pretty ridiculous speeds while you're on the naming screen until the moment you press OK on naming your character. Normally with Emerald, we're dealing with speeds around 16 milliseconds for advancement, but because Timer 1 speeds are determined by the Game Boy Advance CPU directly, it runs at about 280,000 per visual frame. However, tiny differences in how long you're pressing and holding buttons on the naming screen can cause you to get completely different ID values, because with how fast the timer count cycles, it can go down different paths through the code depending on how those buttons are pressed. And to make it even dumber, the secret ID is generated separately with another frame perfect A press a bit after the TID is generated. So essentially you gotta start a new game, enter the naming screen frame perfectly, confirm your name with extreme precision, then frame perfectly end the entire Pokemon Emerald intro screen. So to make a save corruption speedrun viable for humans, casual Pokeplayer decided to include one of the most useless Pokemon items, Mail, into the speedrun. Because Mail can be used to very carefully and easily adjust certain values within the corrupted data, allowing runners to reliably create a usable glitchy Pokemon without ever needing the super specific ID combination required by the tool-assisted speedrun. Which unfortunately means that the human route needs to get a little further into the game to actually obtain Mail. So what does that look like exactly? Well, for Emerald, it looks like this. First, we need to check our trainer ID and use a tool to determine which Mudkip starters will work with the specific ID we got for the glitch. Then once we have the Mudkip, we progress through the early parts of the game, catch 3 additional Pokemon along the way, then buy a large amount of orange mail once we reach Petalburg City instead of Oldale Town. After that, we'll then need to perform a series of saves in order to position the save data correctly for the corruption, as well as the very first reset, which happens when the runner opens the delete save data option on the title screen shortly after confirming the deletion. And since the game officially interrupts the erase process, it forces the game to load the backup save data instead of the regular save, where we can start to go into the fun stuff. But first, we'll need to save the game again and reset during the saving process itself to get everything perfectly in place. And if timed just right, the corruption setup will be complete. However, the scary part here is you won't actually know if this worked until after you load back in and do everything I'm about to explain. But no matter what, we'll need to remove all the mail from our Pokemon, save the game again, and reset one more time to fully lock everything into place. Then inside of the PC, we'll rename boxes 1 through 3 with these names, place Mudkip into box 2 slot 27, and after you start placing mail on your Pokemon, you'll begin to notice some weird stuff going on with your final party member's mail, because now it'll start to show question marks instead of blank spaces, indicating that the corruption actually worked. Which means that all you have to do now is replace the first, fifth, and seventh words with things from the Gen 3 mail corruption tool, grab the third Pokemon in your party, and swap it with the glitchy Mudkip. Because with the corrupted Mudkip now having such a long name combined with weird box names, the function used to move the cursor around extends into the box name data to execute the code we wrote to warp you to the Hall of Fame with a simple swap and let humans beat Pokemon Emerald in as fast as 15 minutes as of this video. But as crazy as this run is, Emerald was only one of 3 games that fell to this discovery. And the best part is all 3 games have a completely different speedrun route using save corruption. Pokemon Sapphire in particular is actually pretty unique because despite the similarities, it wasn't actually built exactly like Emerald was, where the naming screen makes things complicated. Which means that we don't need to care about getting past timer 1 and can instead do a similar route to the task where TID and SID manipulation are very human viable. Which is actually really cool because it lets us skip an entire trainer and a trip to Petalburg just to buy mail, meaning the moment that we catch an extra party member and reach Oldale Town, we can start save corrupting and changing box names immediately to warp to the Hall of Fame in a little around 11 minutes. But as crazy as both of those runs are, they are without a doubt the simplest ones, because figuring out Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, hi, future PulseEffects here, and I have to retcon this entire section because Fire Red Leaf Green has been officially figured out and is apparently considered to be one of the worst speedrun categories to ever exist. So first off, you guys remember all the nasty BS about Timer 1 I mentioned? Well, Fire Red Leaf Green thrives in Timer 1 because of its awful title screen, which is used to set the game's RNG, which makes saving and quitting to manipulate outcomes, stats, and Pokemon stupidly hard to perform. And so you'd think we'd end up relying on mail again to avoid all that, but the closest place to get mail is Celadon City, which takes almost an entire hour to get to. And unfortunately, that is just too slow to be considered in a speedrun. So, Casual Pokeplayer had to once again invent another way to reach our goal of save corruption, but with the daunting nastiness of Timer 1 looming in the background, twice. One to obtain a specific starter and the other to obtain a specific wild Pokemon, both of which have a specific personality ID that works alongside save corruption. But what makes this category even more miserable than dealing with Timer 1 is you have to EV train your Pokemon to reach a specific set of effort values just to be able to skip using mail to corrupt your Pokemon. But we won't just be corrupting one Pokemon, we gotta mess with both of them for the TID SID fusion, which does this to Mankey and is followed up by renaming boxes. Then with yet another simple swap, Pokemon Fire Red can currently be beaten in about 24 minutes with a lot of improvements to be had. Because with better encounter luck during EV training, Fire Red can probably be beaten in about 20 minutes or under. But unfortunately, Casual Pokeplayer got very unlucky trying to fish for 5 different 45% Mankeys and 4 different 40% Caterpies for 4 HP and 5 attack EVs to get the corruption to work properly by converting those EVs into a species. But if I'm being completely honest, I don't know how many people are itching to beat this world record anytime soon. However, there is one more giant elephant in the room when it comes to Fire Red Leaf Green, and that is if you're playing Fire Red Leaf Leaf Green on the Nintendo Switch 1 or 2, none of this actually works at all. So essentially, if you reset during saving, the emulator just throws away the incomplete save, preventing save corruption from happening in the first place. And that is pretty much all the crazy stuff that's happened in the glitchy world of Gen 3 Pokemon speedruns, giving us something pretty technical, fairly short, and super sweet to push these times down to places we thought we'd never see. While I'm unsure of how long this hype will last, I'm just happy to see how this has evolved the speedrun, and the fact that we now have separate leaderboards for anyone who doesn't like this kind of speedrun, which just gives us more categories to enjoy. But either way, if you're as excited as I am for the future of games like Fire Red and Leaf Green and more, then you should subscribe to Casual Pokeplayer for whatever future insanity they have in store for another Pokemon game. And if you want to hear a nice breakdown of those projects, I'll be here to report them as always, so subscribe here as well for future Pokemon speedrunning news and content. And special thanks as well as always to my many supporters on Patreon.